Picture this. You own everything money can buy: mansions, private jets, a business empire worth billions. Presidents call you for advice. The world sees you as the ultimate success story. But tonight, as you stand in your marble-floored penthouse, office overlooking Manhattan, you're about to hear 5 words that will shatter your soul and change everything forever. Your son hasn't eaten all day, sir. This is the true story of Beric Sloan, a man who thought he had it all until he realized he had nothing. If stories of redemption, second chances, and the power of love move your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more life-changing stories like this one. Now let me take you inside the life of a billionaire CEO who was about to discover that success without love is the most expensive failure of all. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about what truly matters in life. The elevator ascends 50 floors in absolute silence, carrying Beric Sloan toward his glass throne in the Manhattan sky. Each floor that passes represents another $1 million in his empire, another achievement in his relentless pursuit of more. At 42, he commands a technology conglomerate worth $3 billion. His signature appears on contracts that reshape entire industries. World leaders seek his counsel on matters of global economics. Yet tonight, as those elevator doors slide open with their familiar whisper, Beric Sloan feels something he hasn't experienced in years: dread. The penthouse office sprawls before him like a monument to ambition, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a god's-eye view of the city, Italian marble floors that cost more than most people's homes, and a mahogany desk where he's signed deals worth hundreds of millions. But tonight, none of it feels like victory. Tonight, it feels like a mausoleum. His assistant's voice echoes from the outer office, speaking in hushed tones to someone on the phone. "Mr. Sloan? He won't be home until after midnight again. He's been in back-to-back meetings since 6 a.m. No, I don't think he'll be available for dinner, or breakfast tomorrow. For that matter." The words slice through Beric like shards of ice. He moves toward his desk on autopilot, muscle memory guiding him through the motions of success, while his mind reels with a growing sense of emptiness. When did his life become a series of meetings that keep him from everything that should matter? The security monitor flickers to life, showing feeds from his Long Island estate 30 miles away. Room after room of his 12-bedroom mansion appears on screen, each one perfect, pristine, and utterly devoid of life. The formal living room with its museum-quality furniture sits empty. The library with its first-edition collections remains untouched. The game room with its expensive toys lies dormant. Then the camera switches to the dining room, and Beric's world stops spinning. A small figure sits alone at a table designed for 20 guests. 6-year-old Cale Sloan perches on a chair too tall for his small frame, his legs dangling in the air like a marionette with cut strings. Before him sits a plate of gourmet food prepared by their private chef, food that has long since grown cold and congealed into an unappetizing mass of waste. But it's not the uneaten dinner that makes Beric's breath catch in his throat. It's his son's posture. Cale's small shoulders are hunched forward in defeat, his chin resting in his tiny hands as he stares at the doorway with the kind of patience that only comes from endless, hopeless waiting. The boy's eyes hold a resignation that no 6-year-old should ever possess, the look of a child who has learned not to expect his father to come home. Beric reaches for his phone with trembling fingers, intending to call the house, to speak to his son, to somehow bridge the 30 miles of distance and 3 years of neglect. But his hand freezes when he realizes the devastating truth. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know how to talk to his own child. He doesn't know when conversations with Kyle became as foreign to him as conversations in a language he's never learned. This is the moment when Beric Sloan, master of the universe, conqueror of markets, bender of economies to his will, realizes that he has failed at the only job that truly matters. He owns everything a man could desire, yet he's losing the one person who should matter more than all of it combined. The camera feed continues its silent testimony, showing a little boy waiting for a father who has forgotten how to come home. 3 years ago, Beric Sloan was a different man entirely. Success had not yet consumed his soul, though it was already growing hungry. He was still driven, still ambitious, still building his technological empire with the fierce determination that had carried him from a working-class childhood in Detroit to the pinnacles of Manhattan power. But back then he was tempered by love. Sarah Sloane had been his anchor in the storm of ambition. She was a pediatric nurse who understood pressure and dedication, but she also understood balance in ways that Beric was only beginning to learn. She could match his intensity when it came to building their future, but she never let him forget that the future was meaningless without love to fill it. When Kyle was born, Beric experienced a transformation he hadn't expected. Holding his son for the first time, feeling that tiny hand wrap around his finger with complete trust, he understood for the first time what it meant to be responsible for something more precious than profit margins. He would spend hours in the nursery, watching Kyle sleep, marveling at the miracle of this perfect little person who shared his DNA and his hopes for tomorrow. Those were golden days. Beric would leave the office at reasonable hours, eager to return to the chaos and joy of family life. He learned to change diapers with the same precision he brought to corporate negotiations. He mastered the art of bedtime stories, creating elaborate adventures featuring brave princes and magical kingdoms that made Kyle giggle with delight. He discovered that success measured in baby's first words and tentative first steps felt more meaningful than any quarterly earnings report. But success has gravity, and Beric's empire was growing faster than his ability to control it. The technology sector was exploding with opportunities that demanded immediate attention and decisive action. Companies that hesitated fell behind. Entrepreneurs who couldn't adapt found themselves obsolete. The market rewarded the bold and buried the cautious, and Beric had no intention of being buried. Late nights became the norm as he worked to secure funding for expansion into Asian markets. Weekend strategy sessions stretched into family time as he negotiated partnerships with European tech giants. The nursery visits became less frequent, then rare, then non-existent, as Beric convinced himself that building financial security for his family was the highest expression of love he could offer. Sarah began making jokes about being a single mother, but Beric could see the hurt behind her laughter. She would place Kyle in his high chair and tell the baby, "Say goodbye to Daddy, because we won't see him until Sunday." The words were meant to be playful, but they carried the weight of growing resentment and loneliness. The fight started small, discussions about missed dinners and forgotten promises that escalated into arguments about priorities and values. Sarah accused Beric of caring more about his next acquisition than his own family. Beric responded with cold logic about providing for their future, about building something that would secure Kyle's education and Sarah's comfort for generations to come. "I'm not working this hard for me," he would tell her during their increasingly frequent arguments. "I'm doing this for us, for him. I'm building something that will last." What good is something that lasts if you're not here to share it with us? Sarah would reply, her voice breaking with frustration and sadness. The night Sarah died, they had been fighting about exactly this. She had confronted him about missing Kyle's first school play, about choosing a board meeting over their son's debut performance as a singing pumpkin in the harvest pageant. Beric had been dismissive, explaining that the board meeting was crucial for securing funding that would ensure Kyle could attend any school he wanted when he was older. "He doesn't want to attend any school when he's older," Sarah had said, tears streaming down her face. "He wants his father to be proud of him right now, today, while he's still small enough to fit in your lap and young enough to think you're the most important person in the world." Beric had responded with the arrogance of a man who believed his own press releases. "Sarah, you're being emotional. I can't base business decisions on the whims of a 3-year-old. There will be other plays." But there wouldn't be other plays. Not for Sarah. She had stormed out, taking Kyle to her mother's house for the night. The last words they spoke were filled with anger and accusation, with the kind of cruelty that only people who love each other can inflict. Sarah accused him of becoming a stranger to his own family. Beric accused her of not understanding the sacrifices necessary for success. The car accident happened at 11:47 p.m. on Interstate 495. A drunk driver ran a red light at an intersection Sarah had driven through safely thousands of times before. The impact killed her instantly, the police said. She wouldn't have suffered. But Beric would suffer for the rest of his life, knowing that their last conversation had been a battle, that her final memory of him was disappointment and rage. Cale survived with minor injuries, but the trauma of losing his mother in such a sudden, violent way left scars that 3 years had not been able to heal. At the funeral, the 3-year-old kept asking when Mommy was coming home, unable to understand the permanence of death or the magnitude of their loss. Beric had stood at Sarah's graveside, holding his son's small hand, and made a promise that he would be both mother and father now. He would love Cale enough for both parents. He would be present and engaged, and everything that Sarah had wanted him to be. But grief is a strange beast, and Beric's way of handling it was to dive deeper into work. He told himself that building financial security was how he honored Sarah's memory, that creating a legacy worthy of her sacrifice was the best way to process his pain. He hired the finest nannies money could buy, enrolled Cale in the most prestigious private schools, surrounded his son with every comfort and opportunity that wealth could provide. What he didn't provide was himself. The estate on Long Island became a monument to guilty conscience, rather than a home filled with love. 12 bedrooms echoed with the sound of Beric's footsteps as he moved through the halls like a ghost haunting his own life. 8 bathrooms remained pristine because no one was there to use them. The Olympic-sized pool sat empty because there was no one to swim with. The gardens required a team of professional landscapers because there was no family to enjoy them. Staff members moved through their duties with professional efficiency, caring for Kyle's physical needs while his emotional world withered away. They fed him gourmet meals in a dining room that could seat 20 but held only one lonely little boy. They maintained his schedule of private tutors and enrichment activities designed to give him every advantage that money could buy. They ensured that his clothes were perfectly pressed, his room was immaculately clean, and his academic progress met the highest standards. What they couldn't provide was the one thing Cale needed most: a father who chose to be present rather than simply available by phone. Beric told himself this arrangement was temporary. Once the Singapore expansion was complete, once the Tokyo merger was finalized, once the quarterly projections exceeded analyst expectations, then he would have time. Then he would be the father Cale deserved. Then he would fulfill the promise he had made at Sarah's grave. But quarters turned into years, and promises became excuses worn thin by repetition. The distance between father and son grew wider with each missed bedtime story, each forgotten school event, each evening when Cale fell asleep waiting for a father who never came home. On a crisp October morning that would change everything, the elite Pemberton Domestic Agency made their most important placement call in company history, though they had no way of knowing it at the time. Their latest recommendation came with an unusual disclaimer. Zaya Monroe's resume was impressive but unconventional. She possessed credentials that should have made her a perfect fit for Manhattan's most exclusive families, yet something about her file suggested she might be too real, too authentic for the rarefied air of the Upper East Side. Zaya Monroe was 33 years old, though her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen enough of life's cruelties to understand the value of its small kindnesses. She possessed a master's degree in elementary education from Emory University, earned while working 3 part-time jobs to pay for tuition that her widowed mother couldn't afford. For 8 years, she had taught in Atlanta's public school system, specializing in children who had been written off by other educators, kids from broken homes, kids with learning disabilities, kids whose potential was hidden beneath layers of trauma and neglect. She had a gift for seeing the light in children that others had given up on, for coaxing growth from soil that seemed too damaged to nurture life. Her classroom was a sanctuary where wounded souls could heal and hesitant spirits could find their voice. She had been Teacher of the Year twice, had turned around reading scores in schools that had been labeled failing by state assessments, had created programs that helped children thrive, despite circumstances that should have crushed their dreams. But gifts like Zia's came with a price. She earned a teacher's salary while doing the work of a miracle worker, stretching every dollar to cover not only her own modest needs, but also the college tuition of her younger sister Amara, who was pursuing a nursing degree at Georgia State. When their mother died of ovarian cancer the previous spring, Zia had been forced to choose between her calling and her family's survival. The choice broke her heart, but it was no choice at all. Amara had 1 year left in nursing school and, without financial support, she would have to drop out and take a minimum wage job to survive. So Zia had submitted her resignation from the school district, packed her few belongings into a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and driven north to New York City with a plan to work for wealthy families long enough to secure Amara's future. The Pemberton agency had been skeptical at first. Their clients typically demanded nannies with pedigrees as impressive as their own, graduates of elite Swiss finishing schools, women who spoke multiple languages and could navigate the complex social hierarchies of Manhattan's aristocracy. Zia Monroe spoke fluent Spanish and passable French, but she had learned both languages in public school classrooms rather than European finishing schools. Her references came from teachers and principals rather than senators and celebrities. But there was something in Zia's interview that convinced even the most discriminating placement counselors. She possessed an indefinable quality that no amount of finishing school polish could replicate: genuine care for children that went beyond professional duty. When asked about her philosophy of childcare, she didn't recite theories from prestigious educational journals. Instead, she spoke with quiet passion about the sacred responsibility of nurturing young minds and hearts. Children don't need perfect caregivers, she had told the agency director. They need present caregivers. They need adults who see them as complete human beings with their own thoughts and feelings and dreams, not as small projects to be managed and improved. It was this philosophy that brought her to the Sloan estate on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a single suitcase and wearing a simple navy dress that cost less than what most of the previous nannies spent on handbags. She approached the imposing gates of the compound without intimidation, taking in the obvious wealth around her without being either impressed or judgmental. This was simply where she had been called to work, and work was something Zia Monroe had never been afraid of. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Hendricks, the estate manager, since Mr. Sloan was, predictably, unavailable due to urgent business matters that couldn't be postponed. Mrs. Hendricks led Zia through the mansion with the practiced efficiency of someone who had given this tour dozens of times to a succession of nannies who rarely lasted more than a few months. The house was a masterpiece of architectural achievement and interior design, but Zia noticed what Mrs. Hendricks didn't mention. It felt like a museum rather than a home. The furniture was beautiful but unwelcoming, chosen for aesthetic impact rather than comfort. The rooms were perfectly maintained, but clearly unlived in, spaces designed for admiration rather than affection. Mr. Sloan travels frequently for business, Mrs. Hendricks explained as they walked through the formal living areas. He maintains residences in Tokyo, London, and San Francisco, and his schedule requires considerable flexibility. Master Kale has a very structured routine designed to maximize his educational and social development. Zia nodded politely, but her first question wasn't about schedules or travel requirements. What about Kale himself? What makes him happy? What does he love to do when no one's watching? Mrs. Hendricks paused, clearly taken aback by the question. In her years of managing the estate, no nanny had ever asked about Kale's emotional needs rather than his practical requirements. She began to recite the boy's scheduled activities: private tutoring sessions, piano lessons with a Juilliard graduate, tennis instruction from a former Wimbledon competitor, supervised playdates with children from similarly affluent families. Those are wonderful opportunities, Zia said gently, but I'm asking about something different. What makes Kale laugh? What does he dream about? What comforts him when he's sad or scared? The questions hung in the air like challenges to everything the household had been built around. Mrs. Hendricks realized with uncomfortable clarity that she didn't know the answers because no one had ever thought to ask them. Later that afternoon, Zia met Kyle for the first time in the mansion's library, a room so vast and imposing that it rivaled university collections. The 6-year-old sat on the Persian carpet in a pool of afternoon sunlight, surrounded by picture books but not reading them. Instead, he was staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the meticulously maintained gardens, where a team of groundskeepers was raking autumn leaves into perfect geometric piles. Zia entered the room quietly and settled cross-legged on the floor beside him, making herself small and unthreatening. She had learned long ago that children were like wild animals. They responded to genuine interest rather than authority, to patience rather than pressure. "Hi, Kyle," she said softly. "I'm Zia. I'm going to be spending some time with you." "What are you looking at out there?" Kyle turned to study this new adult with the serious intensity that children bring to first meetings. Most grown-ups wanted to know about his schoolwork or his behavior or his accomplishments. This woman seemed interested in his thoughts, which was unusual enough to capture his attention. "The leaf piles," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of longing that broke Zia's heart. "I wish I could jump in them like the kids do in movies, but Mrs. Hendricks says they're not for playing, they're for looking at." Zia followed his gaze to the pristine leaf piles that would soon be loaded into trucks and hauled away to preserve the estate's flawless appearance. She saw in those manicured heaps a perfect metaphor for Cale's entire existence. Beauty without joy, perfection without purpose, order without love. "You know what I think," she said, leaning closer to Cale as if sharing a secret. "I think leaves are absolutely, definitely 100% for jumping in. That's probably the main reason trees bother to make them in the first place." For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Cale Sloan smiled, really smiled, with his whole face lighting up like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Really?" he whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. "Really?" Zia confirmed with mock seriousness. "In fact, I think it might be against the law in some states to make leaf piles without jumping in them. We might have to check with the leaf police to make sure we're not breaking any important regulations." Kyle giggled, a sound so rare in the Sloan mansion that Mrs. Hendricks, passing by in the hallway, stopped to listen with something approaching wonder. That evening, Barrick arrived home at 11:43 p.m., which represented significant progress in his ongoing battle with work-life balance. He had managed to leave the office before midnight, skip the late-night networking event that his assistant had insisted was crucial for maintaining industry relationships, and actually drive home instead of staying in his Manhattan penthouse apartment. The mansion greeted him with its familiar silence, the kind of quiet that money could buy but love could never afford. Soft accent lighting cast expensive shadows across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, reflecting a life of luxury that felt increasingly hollow with each passing day. He moved through the halls with practiced stealth, not wanting to wake anyone, not ready to face another evening of guilt and regret. But as he passed the kitchen, heading toward his study to review documents for tomorrow's board meeting, he heard voices drifting from the staff quarters, quiet conversation that shouldn't have been happening at nearly midnight. Barrick paused, his hand on the study door, listening to words that would shatter his carefully constructed delusions about his family's well-being. "Mr. Hendricks," Zia was saying, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that came from years of advocating for children, "I need to discuss something important about Cale's eating habits." "Is there a problem with the meal service?" came the reply from the head of household staff, a man whose efficiency had made him indispensable but whose emotional intelligence had never been tested. "Chef Martin prepares all meals according to the nutritional guidelines provided by Master Kyle's pediatrician." "The meals are fine," Zia said carefully, "but Kyle barely touched his dinner tonight. When I asked him about it, he said he wasn't hungry, but I don't think that's the real problem." Barrick found himself moving closer to the conversation, drawn by a growing sense of dread, mixed with desperate curiosity about his son's inner world. "Master Kyle has always been a light eater," Mr. Hendricks said dismissively. "The previous nannies never reported any concerns about his nutritional intake." "Mr. Hendricks," Zia said, and there was steel beneath the silk of her voice, "this little boy sits alone in a dining room designed for 20 people, eating meals prepared by a stranger, served by staff who treat him like a small lord rather than a child who needs connection. He hasn't eaten properly in days because he's not hungry for food. He's hungry for family." The words hit Barrick like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. He leaned against the hallway wall, feeling something fundamental crack inside his chest, not breaking but opening in ways that terrified and relieved him simultaneously. "What would you suggest?" Mr. Hendricks asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice rather than defensive resistance. "Tomorrow morning, I'd like to serve breakfast in the smaller dining area, the one with windows facing the garden where Cale can watch the birds while he eats. I'd like to sit with him and have an actual conversation about his dreams and fears and favorite colors. And I'd like to ask Mr. Sloan if he might consider joining us, even for 15 minutes before he leaves for work." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Sloan household had become. Beric closed his eyes, trying to remember the last time he had eaten a meal with his son, the last time he had asked Cale about anything more substantial than whether he had completed his homework or practiced his piano lessons. "I'll speak with Mr. Sloan about adjusting his morning schedule," Mr. Hendricks said, though his tone suggested he doubted the possibility of success. "Thank you," Zia said. "And Mr. Hendricks, could you ask the groundskeepers to leave one pile of leaves unraked tomorrow? Kyle and I have some very important jumping to do." The conversation continued, but Beric didn't stay to hear more. He walked upstairs to his bedroom on legs that felt disconnected from his body, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had overheard. When was the last time he had thought about Cale's emotional needs, rather than just his physical requirements? When was the last time he had considered what his son might be feeling, rather than simply ensuring that his educational and social obligations were being met? Sleep eluded him completely that night. Instead, he lay in the king-sized bed that had felt too large since Sarah's death, staring at the ceiling and confronting truths he had been avoiding for 3 years. At 3:17 a.m., he did something he hadn't done in months. He walked down the hallway to Kyle's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see his son sleeping peacefully beneath covers decorated with cartoon dinosaurs that Sarah had chosen before her death. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, a small nightlight shaped like a friendly dragon, and a handwritten note in Zaya's careful script. "Sweet dreams, brave boy. Tomorrow is a new adventure waiting for you." Beric stood in that doorway for nearly an hour, watching his son breathe, remembering what it had felt like to be the center of Cale's universe instead of a stranger who happened to pay the bills. He remembered bedtime stories and morning snuggles, remembered the weight of a small body falling asleep in his lap during weekend movie marathons, remembered when love had been more important than profit margins. Cale stirred in his sleep, murmuring something that sounded like "Daddy," and the word pierced through every defense that Beric had built around his heart over the past 3 years. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Beric Sloan cried, deep, silent sobs that came from a place of loss and regret and desperate hope for redemption. He cried for the father he used to be, for the father he had failed to become, and for the father he might still learn to be if it wasn't too late. Standing in his son's doorway at 3 in the morning, surrounded by the silence of a house that had everything except what mattered most, Beric made a promise that would change everything. Tomorrow he would show up. Tomorrow he would choose his son over his empire, even if it was only for 15 minutes. Tomorrow he would begin the long journey back to the man Sarah had fallen in love with and the father Cale deserved. The crack in his foundation had become a fissure, and through that opening, love was finally beginning to seep back in. Dawn broke over the Sloan estate with the kind of autumn brilliance that made even the most jaded New Yorker pause to appreciate nature's artistry. Golden light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the smaller dining room, illuminating a scene that would have been unremarkable in any other household, but felt revolutionary in this one. A table set for 3, with fresh flowers from the garden, simple white plates instead of the usual formal china, and an atmosphere of possibility that hadn't existed in this house for 3 years. Zia had arrived early to prepare what she hoped would be the first of many family breakfasts. She arranged the table with care, choosing the seats that would allow Cale to watch the birds in the garden, while keeping the chair closest to the door available for his father, a man who, she suspected, would need easy escape routes until he learned to be comfortable in his own home. At 7:25 a.m., Beric appeared in the doorway of the dining room like an actor who had forgotten his lines. He wore his usual armor of expensive tailoring, a charcoal grey suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, Italian leather shoes polished to mirror brightness, and a tie that had been selected by his personal stylist rather than any emotional connection to the fabric or color. But beneath the familiar costume of success, Zia could see something different, uncertainty, mixed with genuine desire to connect. Kyle looked up from his cereal with eyes that widened in surprise, and something that might have been hope. In his 6 years of life, breakfast with his father had become as rare as snow in July, an event so unusual that it required careful navigation to avoid disappointment. "Good morning, Daddy," he said quietly, his voice carrying the caution of a child who had learned not to expect too much from adult promises. "Good morning, Cale," Beric replied, and his voice sounded rusty with disuse when it came to addressing his son in anything other than formal, distant terms. He stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment, unsure of how to enter this domestic scene that should have felt natural, but instead felt as foreign as visiting a country where he didn't speak the language. Zia rose gracefully from her seat, her presence serving as a bridge between father and son. "Mr. Sloan, I'm so glad you could join us. Cale was just telling me about the book he's reading. Something about a boy who discovers a dragon egg hidden in his grandmother's attic." She gestured toward the empty chair, and Beric moved toward it with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. Every movement felt significant, every word carried weight. This was more than breakfast. This was his first attempt at rebuilding a relationship that had crumbled from neglect and misplaced priorities. "A dragon egg?" Beric said, settling into his chair and accepting the cup of coffee that Zia poured with quiet efficiency. "That sounds exciting. What happens when it hatches?" For the next 12 minutes, Beric found himself counting because time had become precious in a way he had never experienced before. Kyle talked with animated enthusiasm about dragons and adventure, about magic and friendship, about a world where anything was possible if you believed hard enough. His small face lit up with each detail of the story, and Beric saw Sarah in every expression, heard her laughter in every giggle. When Beric's phone buzzed with its familiar urgency, he looked at the device that had once been his lifeline to importance and success. The screen showed 17 missed calls, 43 unread emails, and a calendar reminder that his first meeting was scheduled to begin in 22 minutes. The old Beric would have been reaching for the phone before the first buzz finished, would have been apologizing to his family for the interruption while simultaneously checking his messages. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He turned, the phone face down on the table, and looked directly at his son. "Tell me more about this dragon," he said, and the words felt like a small revolution. "Does it have a name?" The smile that spread across Kyle's face was worth more than any contract Beric had ever signed, any deal he had ever closed, any acquisition he had ever orchestrated. In that moment, he understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him during their final argument. Success without connection was just an expensive form of emptiness. They talked about dragons and adventures until Beric's driver appeared in the doorway with the polite cough that indicated urgent business, couldn't wait any longer. But instead of rushing away with his usual distracted promises to continue this conversation later, Beric knelt beside Cale's chair. "I have to go to work now," he said, "but I want you to know that hearing about your dragon was the best part. Day of my day. Will you tell me more about the story tomorrow morning?" Cale nodded enthusiastically, and for the first time in years, Beric left for work with something to look forward to at home. Over the following weeks, small changes began to ripple through the Sloan household, like stones dropped into still water. The breakfast ritual evolved from uncertain experiment to cherished routine, with each morning bringing new discoveries about the complex inner world of a 6-year-old boy who had been starving for his father's attention. Beric found himself awakening earlier, not because his alarm demanded it, but because he genuinely looked forward to those precious minutes before the day's obligations pulled him away from his family. He learned that Kyle had inherited Sarah's love of astronomy, but was afraid of the dark because shadows reminded him of the night his mother died. He discovered that his son could recite the names of all the planets and their moons, but couldn't tie his shoes because no one had taken the time to teach him properly. a basic life skill that had been overlooked in favor of advanced academic instruction. Most heartbreaking of all, he learned that Cale held nightly conversations with Sarah's photograph, updating her on his daily adventures and asking her to watch over him in his dreams. The boy had created an elaborate fantasy in which his mother was simply traveling on a very long trip and would return when he had grown big enough to help her with important grown-up work. These revelations came slowly, shared in fragments over breakfast conversations and tentative bedtime stories that Beric began to read with increasing confidence. Zaya served as his translator and guide, helping him understand that 6-year-olds communicated in metaphors and emotions rather than logic and efficiency. When Kyle said he had a bad day, it didn't mean his schedule had been disrupted. It meant that Tommy Chen had laughed at his drawing during art class, or that he had seen a father picking up another child from school and wondered why his own father never came. Children don't need perfect parents, Zia told Beric one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, a meal that Beric had actually attended, arriving home at 6:30 p.m. instead of his usual midnight. They need present parents. They need to know that they matter more than anything else in your world, even when that world is complicated and demanding. The concept was foreign to Beric, whose entire adult life had been built around the pursuit of more money, more success, more recognition, from peers who measured worth in quarterly earnings and market share. The idea of less, of scaling back his ambitions to make room for love, felt like learning to breathe underwater. But he was a quick study when properly motivated, and nothing motivated him more than watching his son blossom under the warmth of genuine attention. Kyle began speaking more freely during their morning conversations, sharing dreams and fears with the kind of openness that only children possess. He talked about wanting to be an astronaut so he could visit his mother among the stars, about hoping to find a dragon egg of his own someday, about wondering if his father would still love him when he made mistakes or failed at important things. Each conversation revealed new layers of the remarkable little person that Cale was becoming, and each revelation made Beric more determined to be worthy of his son's trust and love. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Beric's attempts at fatherhood were rusty from disuse, clumsy with good intentions but poor execution. He tried to help Cale with homework and discovered that 6-year-old math problems were surprisingly complex when you hadn't thought about basic addition in decades. He attempted to read bedtime stories and found himself stumbling over children's books that required different voices for different characters. A skill that Sarah had mastered, but that felt impossible for a man more comfortable with boardroom presentations than puppet shows. But Cale was patient with his father's learning curve, offering gentle corrections and enthusiastic encouragement. "You don't have to make the dragon sound scary, Daddy," he would say. "This is a friendly dragon. He should sound more like someone who wants to help people." And Beric would try again, his voice growing softer and warmer with each attempt. Zaya watched these interactions with the satisfaction of someone who had helped facilitate healing. She offered guidance when asked but never intruded, understanding that the relationship between father and son needed to grow organically rather than being forced or manufactured. Her presence in their home had evolved from employee to something more complex, part teacher, part translator, part guardian angel who had arrived precisely when they needed her most. But the business world doesn't pause for personal revelations, and the demands of Beric's empire grew more insistent as his attention began to drift toward domestic concerns. The Singapore expansion hit unexpected complications when the government changed regulations overnight, threatening to derail 3 years of careful negotiations. A key investor in the Tokyo merger developed cold feet after rival companies began spreading rumors about Beric's recent distraction from business matters. The financial press, always eager for signs of weakness among the powerful, began publishing subtle speculation about whether Beric Sloan was losing his edge. Industry competitors who had once feared his ruthless efficiency started testing the waters, probing for vulnerabilities in deals they would never have dared challenge in previous years. His assistant, Margaret, had been with him for 8 years and had never seen him leave important calls unanswered or delay critical decisions for personal reasons. She began scheduling meetings earlier and later, trying to compress his family time into smaller windows that wouldn't interfere with the machinery of his business empire. "Mr. Sloan," she said one morning as he prepared to leave for breakfast, "with Cale, the Singapore team is waiting for your decision on the regulatory response. They've been holding for 3 days, and every hour of delay is costing us leverage in the negotiations." Beric looked at his watch. 7:25 a.m., 5 minutes before his breakfast appointment with his son. The old version of himself would have taken the call immediately, would have prioritized the Singapore deal over everything else, would have sent apologies to his family while handling urgent business that couldn't wait. Instead, he did something that shocked Margaret into silence. He handed her the phone. "Tell Singapore I'll call them at 9 a.m. sharp, not before. But sir, they specifically requested at 9 a.m. Margaret. Some things can't be rescheduled." He walked toward the dining room, leaving his assistant staring after him with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a religious conversion. The breakfast conversation that morning was more precious because of what it had cost him. Cale shared his excitement about a field trip to the planetarium, describing in elaborate detail the solar system model they would build and the astronaut suit he hoped to try on. Beric listened with the intensity he usually reserved for merger negotiations, asking questions and offering encouragement, while part of his mind calculated the millions of dollars that might be slipping away with each passing minute. When he finally returned the Singapore call at precisely 9 a.m., his team was frustrated but grudgingly impressed by his decisiveness. The delay had actually worked in their favor, they discovered, as the government regulators had used the extra time to reconsider their position and offer more favorable terms. But not every conflict resolved so neatly. The tension between Beric's two worlds, the empire he had built and the family he was trying to rebuild, created a constant state of internal war. Important calls interrupted dinner conversations. Weekend work sessions encroached on promised family time. Emergency meetings conflicted with school events that Cale had been excitedly anticipating. Each compromise felt necessary in the moment, but eroded the foundation of trust that was slowly being rebuilt between father and son. Cale began to recognize the signs, the way his father's jaw tightened when his phone buzzed, the distracted look that crept into his eyes when business concerns intruded on family time, the apologetic tone that preceded another broken promise. The key first real test, 42 to 48 minutes. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in November, when autumn had painted the estate gardens in shades of gold and crimson that took Cale's breath away. Snow was forecast for the weekend, the first substantials, snowfall of the season, and Cale had been planning an elaborate snow fort construction project with his father. They had spent hours discussing the architectural requirements, drawing blueprints on napkins during breakfast, negotiating the essential features that would make their fort the most magnificent structure ever built. Beric had promised they would start building Saturday morning right after breakfast and work together until they had created something worthy of the castle-building dreams that lived in Cale's imagination. The boy had been counting down the days with the kind of anticipation that only children can muster, crossing off calendar squares and checking weather reports with the dedication of a military strategist. But on Thursday evening, as Beric was reading the final chapter of Cale's current favorite book, a story about a boy who befriends a lonely dragon, his phone rang with the particular insistence that indicated crisis rather than routine business. The caller ID showed his business partner in Tokyo, and Beric knew without answering that this was the call he had been dreading. The merger negotiations had collapsed, victim of cultural misunderstandings and competitor interference. If he didn't fly to Japan immediately, tonight, this very evening, 3 years of careful relationship building would evaporate, taking with it not only $100 million in projected revenue, but also the jobs of nearly 300 employees whose livelihoods depended on the expansion succeeding. "I have to take this," he told Cale, stepping into the hallway while his son waited patiently in bed, still clutching the book they had been reading together. The conversation was brief but devastating. He needed to be on a plane within 4 hours. The meetings would run through the weekend and possibly into the following week. If he could salvage the deal, he would be a hero to his shareholders and employees. If he chose not to go, he would be responsible for one of the most expensive failures in his company's history. When he returned to Cale's bedroom, his son was sitting up against his pillows, still hopeful, but beginning to recognize the familiar signs of disappointment approaching. "Do you have to go away again?" Kyle asked, his voice small and careful, as if speaking too loudly might make the bad news worse. "Yes, buddy, I'm sorry. I know we plan to build the snow fort, but this is very important for the company. More important than me." The question stopped Beric cold. It was the same accusation that Sarah had made during their final argument, the same choice between business success and family love that had haunted him for 3 years. But hearing it from his 6-year-old son, delivered with the devastating honesty that only children possess, hit him like a physical blow. "No," Beric said quickly, kneeling beside the bed and taking Cale's small hands in his own. "Nothing is more important than you, but sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do. People are counting on me to fix problems that only I can solve." "I'm counting on you too," Kyle said, and the simple statement carried the weight of every missed dinner, every broken promise, every time work had taken precedence over love. "I've been counting on you for the snow fort. I drew pictures of what it was going to look like. I asked Mrs. Patterson at school if she thought you would really come this time, and I told her yes, because you promised." The words pierced through every rationalization Beric had constructed around his choices. Here was his son, who had learned not to expect reliability from his father, who had been brave enough to believe in this one promise, who had defended Beric's character. To his teacher, based on faith rather than evidence. "I know you've been counting on me," Beric said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't hide. "And when I get back, we'll build the biggest, most amazing snow fort anyone has ever seen. We'll build a whole snow village if you want." But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow and insufficient. Kyle had heard similar promises before, had learned that "when I get back" was adult language for maybe never, had discovered that his father's work always seemed to generate new emergencies that required immediate attention. Kyle nodded with the resigned acceptance of a child who had been disappointed too many times to maintain hope, and that nod broke something fundamental inside Beric's chest. "Okay, Daddy," Kyle said quietly. "I understand." But understanding and forgiveness were different things, and as Beric kissed his son goodnight and headed downstairs to pack for Japan, he could feel the fragile trust they had been building beginning to crack under the weight of another broken promise. At 2:30 a.m., Beric stood in his master bedroom, mechanically packing clothes into a suitcase while his family slept, unaware of the choice he was making. The routine was familiar from hundreds of previous business trips: passport, documents, phone charges, the expensive suits that served as armor in international negotiations. But tonight, each item felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge of what this departure would cost him. The house around him was quiet, except for the soft sounds of a family at rest, the gentle hum of the heating system, the distant whisper of wind through autumn trees, the barely audible sound of Cale's peaceful breathing from down the hall. These were the sounds of home, he realized, sounds he had been too busy to notice during all those years when success had seemed more important than presence. A soft knock at his bedroom door interrupted his melancholy packing. Zaya stood in the doorway wearing a simple robe, her hair pulled back, looking every inch the guardian angel she had become for his family. Her presence at this hour wasn't surprising. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when the fragile balance of their household was threatened. "You don't have to go," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth rather than naive optimism. "Yes, I do," Beric replied, continuing to fold shirts with unnecessary precision. 300 jobs are at stake, $100 million in investment, 3 years of relationship building with partners who will never trust me again if I abandon them now. What about your relationship with your son? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Beric thought he understood about responsibility and sacrifice. "Kyle will understand when he's older," Beric said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "When he has children of his own, he'll appreciate the sacrifices I made to secure his future." Zaya stepped into the room, her presence radiating. The kind of calm authority that came from years of advocating for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. "Mr. Sloan," she said, and there was steel beneath the silk of her voice. "I need to tell you something about my father." She moved to the window that overlooked the gardens where Cale had planned to build his snow fort, her reflection ghost-like, in the glass. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled constantly, always chasing the next big account, the next promotion that would finally provide the security and success he thought his family deserved. He missed my school, plays, my birthday parties, my graduation from high school. He always promised he would be there for the important things, but somehow everything else always seemed more urgent. Beric stopped packing, sensing the weight of her words. When I was 16, he had a heart attack in a hotel room in Cleveland, alone, surrounded by product samples and client files instead of the family he thought he was working for. He survived barely, and the doctor told him he had to choose between his health and his career. She turned from the window to face Beric directly. "Do you know what he told me in that hospital room? He said his biggest regret wasn't the deals he didn't close or the promotions he didn't get. His biggest regret was that he had spent 16 years providing for my future while missing my present. He had given me financial security, but had never really known me as a person." The story hit Beric like ice water, forcing him to confront the parallels he didn't want to acknowledge. "He changed after that," Zia continued. "Started coming home for dinner every night, attending my soccer games, asking about my friends and dreams and fears. For 2 years, I finally had the father I had always wanted. Then he died of another heart attack, and I was grateful for those 2 years, but I couldn't help wondering what our relationship would have been like if he had started choosing me sooner." Beric sat heavily on the edge of his bed, his expensive suitcase forgotten. "The Tokyo deal," he began, "will succeed or fail based on factors largely outside your control," Zia interrupted gently. "But your relationship with Kyle will succeed or fail based entirely on the choices you make right now, tonight, in this moment." She moved closer, her voice becoming softer but more insistent. "You've made tremendous progress these past few weeks. Cale has started to believe in you again, started to trust that maybe this time will be different. But children's trust is like glass. Once it's broken, every repair makes it more fragile than before." Beric looked at his hands, manicured and soft from a life spent in boardrooms rather than snow forts. "If I don't go, people will lose their jobs. Shareholders will lose millions. My reputation." "Your reputation will recover," Zia said firmly. "Business setbacks are temporary, but the look in your son's eyes tomorrow morning when he realizes you're gone, that's permanent. That's the moment when he stops believing that anything he wants could ever be more important than anything you need." The truth of her words settled over him like a weight he could no longer carry. In trying to provide everything for his son, he had been giving him nothing. In building an empire to secure Kyle's future, he had been destroying their present. Beric looked at his phone, at the boarding pass email that would take him 8,000 miles away from the only person who truly mattered. For the first time in his adult life, success felt like failure, and responsibility felt like betrayal. The choice he had to make wasn't between business and family. It was between the man he had been and the man he could still become, between the father who provided and the father who loved, between everything he had built and everything that truly mattered. As dawn approached and his driver waited outside to take him to the airport, Beric Sloan faced the most important decision of his life. The black Mercedes sedan glided through the pre-dawn darkness of Long Island, like a hearse carrying the remains of Beric's former self toward its final resting place. The luxury vehicle's interior was silent except for the soft hum of German engineering and the relentless buzz of his phone, which displayed an endless stream of messages from his Tokyo team, urgent updates from his assistant, and increasingly frantic communications from business partners who were counting on his presence to salvage their collapsing deal. Each notification felt like another nail in the coffin of the life he had been trying to build with Cale and Zaya. The Singapore expansion, the Tokyo merger, the carefully orchestrated dance of international commerce, it all seemed suddenly hollow, a performance he had been giving for an audience that didn't include the only people who truly mattered. Beric sat in the back seat like a condemned man being transported to his execution, his expensive luggage beside him and his heart heavy with the weight of choice. The familiar route to the airport had never felt longer, each mile taking him further from his sleeping son and deeper into the prison of his own making. He found himself memorizing landmarks along the way. The 24-hour diner where he had once promised to take Kyle for pancakes, the park where other families played on weekends while he worked in his office, the suburban neighborhoods where normal fathers came home for dinner every night. The driver, Robert, had been chauffeuring Manhattan's elite for 25 years, had witnessed the rise and fall of titans, had observed the personal cost of professional ambition played out in the backseat of his vehicle countless times. He maintained his usual discreet silence, but in the rearview mirror, he could see the anguish written across his passenger's face. This wasn't the confident CEO he had driven to hundreds of important meetings. This was a man being torn apart by competing loyalties, and Robert had seen enough broken families to recognize the signs. "Excuse me, sir," Robert said quietly, breaking his own rule about passenger interaction. "Would you like me to adjust the route? Perhaps take the scenic way to give you more time to think?" The offer was made with such gentle understanding that Beric felt his carefully constructed composure crack slightly. "Thank you, Robert. But no, if I'm going to do this, I need to do it quickly, before I lose my nerve entirely." "Very good, sir," Robert replied, but he caught Beric's eyes in the mirror. "For what it's worth, in all my years driving executives to the airport, I've never seen one look quite so conflicted about a business trip. Usually they're eager to get there and get started. You look like a man being dragged to his own funeral." The observation was more perceptive than Beric wanted to acknowledge. As they passed through Queens in the grey hour before sunrise, he found himself thinking about death, not literal death, but the death of the father he was finally learning to become. How many Saturday mornings did he have left before Cale grew, too old to want to build snow forts with his father? How many bedtime stories remained before his son stopped asking him to read aloud? How many chances would he get to be the hero in his child's eyes, instead of the stranger who paid the bills? The arithmetic of fatherhood was devastatingly simple. Every day he chose to be absent was a day he could never recover. Every promise he broke made the next one harder to believe. Every time he prioritized work over family made it less likely that his family would be there when work finally ended. His phone rang with the distinctive tone he had assigned to international calls. James Morrison, his business partner in Tokyo, was calling with what would undoubtedly be a final update before Beric's flight departed. The phone buzzed insistently in his hand, demanding attention, promising crisis, threatening catastrophe if immediate action wasn't taken. But something had changed in Beric during that long drive through the darkness. For the first time in his corporate career, the sound of his phone didn't trigger an automatic response. Instead, he found himself looking at the device as if seeing it for the first time. This electronic leash that had kept him tethered to other people's emergencies while his own family slowly starved for his attention. For the first time in his adult life, Beric let the phone ring until it stopped. The silence that followed felt revolutionary, as if he had just declared independence from a tyrant who had ruled his life for decades. At JFK Airport, first-class check-in proceeded with its usual ballet of privilege and efficiency. His boarding pass was printed on heavy cardstock that felt substantial in his hands. His luggage was whisked away by uniformed attendants who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who understood the importance of wealthy passengers' time, and he was escorted to the Centurion Lounge with the kind of deference reserved for travelers whose tickets cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The lounge was a temple to business-class luxury, all polished marble and soft leather, populated by other titans of industry who moved through the space like sharks navigating familiar waters. They were all focused on their devices, all racing toward their next deal, their next triumph, their next validation that they were indispensable to the machinery of global commerce. The air hummed with the barely contained energy of people who had convinced themselves that the world would stop spinning if they weren't personally present to keep it turning. Beric had been one of them for so long that he could navigate this world blindfolded, could speak its language of leverage and synergy and market penetration without conscious thought. But this morning, sitting in a leather chair that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by fellow warriors in the endless battle for more, Beric felt like an alien visiting a planet he no longer understood. He watched his fellow passengers with new eyes, seeing for the first time the emptiness beneath their expensive clothes, the desperation hidden behind their confident facades. How many of them had families they were running away from in the name of providing for? How many had children who had stopped waiting for them to come home? How many were repeating his own mistakes, convinced that success and love were mutually exclusive? A man at the next table was speaking loudly into his phone, berating someone about quarterly projections while completely oblivious to the fact that everyone around him could hear his conversation. Another executive was typing furiously on her laptop, her face illuminated by the blue glow of spreadsheets that would be forgotten within a month. Across the room, a group of business partners was discussing a merger, with the kind of intensity usually reserved for matters of life and death. Though Beric knew from experience that most of these crucial deals would prove to be footnotes in corporate history, he opened his briefcase to review the negotiation strategy one final time, and his breath caught in his throat. There, tucked between contracts and financial projections, was a drawing that Cale had made during breakfast 3 days earlier. The paper was slightly wrinkled from being carried around, and there was a small jam stain in one corner from when Kyle had been eating toast while working on his masterpiece. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands in a garden filled with flowers and butterflies, a tall man labeled Daddy in careful block letters, a woman with kind eyes labeled Zaya, and a small boy in the middle labeled Me. The figures were surrounded by a rainbow, a sun with a smiling face, and what appeared to be a dragon flying overhead, carrying a banner that read, "Happy Family." At the bottom of the page, in Cale's careful 6-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My family is the best family in the whole world." The drawing hit Beric like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the enormous gap between his son's perception and reality. In Kyle's mind, they were already a complete family. Father, son, and the woman who had brought love back into their empty mansion. The child's drawing radiated happiness and security, the innocent confidence of someone who believed in the permanence of love, who had no idea that his father was about to abandon him again for the sake of a business deal that would be forgotten by next year. But permanence required presence, and Beric was about to board a plane that would take him 8,000 miles away from the family his son had drawn with such hope and joy. The boarding announcement for Flight 1247 to Tokyo echoed through the terminal with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our boarding process for Flight 1247 to Tokyo Narita International Airport. First-class passengers may now board at Gate 23. We remind passengers that this is a 14-hour flight with no intermediate stops, departing at 6:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 14 hours in the air, suspended between heaven and earth, trapped in a metal tube hurtling toward a destination that felt increasingly like exile. Plus, travel time to and from airports, plus meetings that could stretch for days or weeks, depending on how badly the negotiations had deteriorated. By the time he returned to New York, if he returned at all, the first snow would have melted. The moment for snow-fort construction would have passed forever, and Kyle would have learned once again that his father's promises carried no weight against the demands of international commerce. Beric stood at Gate 23, boarding pass trembling in his hand, watching other passengers file onto the aircraft that would carry him toward what he was beginning to recognize as professional salvation and personal damnation. Around him, fellow business travelers moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who had made similar choices countless times before, sacrificing family dinners for profit margins, missing children's milestones for market opportunities, choosing success over significance without question or regret. A woman in an expensive suit walked past him, speaking loudly into her phone about missing her daughter's school play for an acquisition meeting. "She'll understand when she's older," the woman was saying. "This deal will secure her college fund." Beric wanted to stop her, to tell her that daughters don't remember college funds. They remember empty seats in auditoriums where their mothers should have been sitting. Behind her, a man roughly Beric's age was explaining to someone on the other end of his call why he had to miss another family dinner. "It's just business," he kept repeating, as if the phrase were a magical incantation that could transform abandonment into virtue. "Just business, honey. The kids will understand." Beric had been one of them for so long that this decision should have been automatic. The Tokyo deal represented everything he had worked toward for the past 5 years. International expansion, market dominance, the kind of success that would cement his legacy in business history. Failure to appear would mark him as unreliable in an industry that worshipped at the altar of dependability. It would damage relationships that had taken years to build, would cost his company millions and potentially hundreds of jobs. But as he approached the boarding gate, Beric's steps grew slower, more deliberate, as if his body was rebelling against a decision his mind had already made. His legs felt like they were moving through concrete, each step requiring enormous effort to execute. His phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, his assistant. "Driver reports you've arrived at airport safely. Tokyo team is standing by. For your call upon landing, all meeting materials have been forwarded to your hotel. Weather forecast shows clear skies. Safe travels, Mr. Sloan." Then another message, this one from James Morrison. "Thank God you're coming, Beric. Without you here, this deal is dead in the water. The cultural issues are worse than we anticipated, and they're questioning our commitment to the partnership. See you in 12 hours. Don't let me down." And then, as if the universe itself was testing his resolve, a message that stopped him in his tracks. It was from Zaya, sent just minutes earlier. "Kyle woke up asking if you had left yet. He couldn't go back to sleep because he was worried he hadn't said goodbye properly. I told him you were still deciding. He wanted me to send you this." The attached photo took several seconds to load on the airport's spotty Wi-Fi, and when it finally appeared, Beric felt his heart stop beating entirely. It showed a piece of paper torn from a coloring book, wrinkled and obviously handled by small, anxious fingers. In crayon letters that wobbled with the uncertain hand of childhood, Kyle had written, "Dear Daddy, I love you more than all the money in the world. Please don't go. Love, Kyle." Below the message was a drawing of a snow fort with 2 stick figures. Standing beside it, both smiling, both holding hands. One figure was tall and wore what appeared to be a business suit. The other was small and wore a winter hat with a pom-pom. Between them was a heart drawn in red crayon, with the words "Best Friends Forever" written inside it. Beric stared at the image until his vision blurred with tears he hadn't expected. Here was his son, reaching across the distance of disappointment and broken promises, offering love without conditions, believing against all evidence that his father might still choose him over everything else. The message was devastating in its simplicity, a 6-year-old's attempt to communicate the most fundamental truth of his existence, that love was more valuable than money, that presence was more precious than profit, that being wanted by his father mattered more than any business deal ever could. The boarding line moved forward, and Beric found himself just 3 people away from the gate agent's desk, ticket scanner ready to seal his fate with the electronic beep that would register his departure. Behind him, the line of passengers grew longer, filled with people who had made their choices and were prepared to live with the consequences. The business traveler directly in front of him was complaining loudly to his companion about his ex-wife, who was apparently threatening to reduce his visitation rights if he missed another one of his son's soccer games. "She doesn't understand the pressure I'm under," the man was saying. "These international deals don't just handle themselves. I'm doing this for him, for his future." Beric wanted to grab the man by his expensive lapels and shake him, to tell him that children don't care about future financial security when they're 7 years old and looking for their father in the stands. He wanted to explain that doing it for them was just another way of saying doing it instead of being with them. But the man was already handing his boarding pass to the gate agent, already stepping across the threshold that separated fathers who were present from fathers who were profitable. "Next passenger, please," the gate agent called. And suddenly Beric was at the front of the line, facing a young woman whose smile was as professionally polished as her uniform. "First class to Tokyo," she asked with practiced courtesy, her hand extended to receive his boarding pass. Beric looked at her, then at his boarding pass, then at the image of his son's drawing still glowing on his phone screen. Behind him, other passengers were growing impatient, checking their watches and muttering about delays. Ahead of him lay the jetway that would carry him toward the aircraft, that would carry him toward a future that suddenly felt like imprisonment. "Sir, is there a problem with your ticket?" For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, Beric stood frozen at the threshold between his old life and whatever came next. Behind him lay the safety of familiar choices, the comfortable prison of success. Without meaning, the well-worn path of choosing profit over presence. Ahead lay uncertainty, professional consequences, the terrifying possibility of becoming the father he had always meant to be, but had never found the courage to attempt. In his mind, he could hear Cale's voice from the night before. "I've been counting on you for the snow fort. I drew pictures of what it was going to look like. I asked Mrs. Patterson at school if she thought you would really come this time, and I told her yes because you promised." He could hear Zia's quiet wisdom. Children's trust is like glass. Once it's broken, every repair makes it more fragile than before. He could hear Sarah's voice from their final argument. He doesn't want to attend any school when he's older. He wants his father to be proud of him right now, today, while he's still small enough to fit in your lap and young enough to think you're the most important person in the world. And underneath all of those voices, he could hear the sound of his own heart breaking at the thought of disappointing his son one more time, of choosing money over love one more time, of boarding another plane that would take him away from the only person who truly mattered. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the terminal. "I'm not getting on this plane." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence from everything Beric had once believed about success, responsibility, and the price of love. The gate agent looked at him with confusion, clearly unprepared for passengers who refused boarding after reaching the gate. "I'm sorry, sir, did you say you're not boarding?" "That's correct," Beric said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not getting on this plane. In fact, I'm going home." He turned away from the gate, away from the aircraft that would have carried him toward professional triumph and personal disaster, and began walking back through the terminal. Behind him, he could hear the gate agent speaking into her radio, probably reporting the unusual behavior of a first-class passenger who had apparently suffered some kind of breakdown. But Beric had never felt more clear-headed in his life. His phone rang immediately. James Morrison calling from Tokyo, undoubtedly panicked by the delayed boarding notification that would have reached the international team within minutes. Beric looked at the screen, at the name of the man who had been his business partner for 8 years, who was counting on him to save a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He answered the call while continuing to walk toward the terminal. "Exit, James." "Beric, thank God, there's some confusion about your flight. The gate agent said you're not boarding. That can't be right." "It's not confusion, James. I'm not coming to Tokyo." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Beric wondered if the connection had been lost. "What do you mean you're not coming?" "Beric, this deal dies without you. 3 years of work, gone. The board will crucify us." "Both?" "Then we'll let it die," Beric said, surprised by the calmness in his own voice. "You're capable of handling this without me. Make the best deal you can with the cards we have, and if they won't negotiate in good faith, walk away." "Walk away? From $100 million? James, my son thinks I'm worth more than all the money in the world. I'm starting to think he might be right." The explanation sounded inadequate, even to Beric's ears, but it was the only truth he could offer. How do you explain to a business partner that you've suddenly realized you've been playing the wrong game your entire adult life? "Beric, are you having some kind of breakdown? Should I call someone?" "I'm having a breakthrough," Beric said. "I'm going home to build a snow fort with my son. You handle Tokyo. If the deal survives, great. If it doesn't, we'll build something better." He hung up before James could respond, then immediately called Margaret. "Cancel everything," he told his assistant, who had been with him through countless crises but had never heard him sound quite like this. "Clear my calendar for the weekend. Actually, clear it for Monday and Tuesday as well. Reschedule the board meeting. Tell the investors I'll call them next week." "Sir?" You have the Hartwell presentation on Monday morning and the quarterly review. With the directors is... Margaret, Berwick interrupted gently. Some things are more important than quarterly reviews. I'm taking a few days to remember what those things are. As he walked through the terminal, past shops and restaurants and gates leading to destinations around the world, Berwick felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The lightness of choosing love over fear, presence over profit, connection over conquest. His phone continued to buzz with increasingly frantic messages from his business empire, but he ignored them all. For the first time in his adult life, being unreachable felt like freedom rather than irresponsibility. The return to what matters, 73 to 75 minutes. The drive home from JFK took 47 minutes, but it felt like a journey between two different universes. Berwick sat in the back seat of the same Mercedes that had carried him toward what he now recognized as exile, watching the familiar landscape of Queens and Nassau County roll past his window with new eyes. Everything looked different when viewed through the lens of a man who had just chosen his family over his empire. The suburban houses with their small yards and swing sets no longer looked like settlements for people who lacked ambition. They looked like homes where families actually lived together, where fathers came home for dinner and mothers didn't have to explain why Daddy was always traveling. When the car turned into the long driveway of the Sloane estate, Berwick could see warm light glowing from the windows of the smaller dining room. Through the glass he glimpsed movement, his family having breakfast without him, as they had so many times before. But this time would be different. This time, he was choosing to come home. The snow had started falling during his drive from the airport, fat flakes that drifted down like blessings from a sky that seemed to understand the significance of this moment. By the time he stepped out of the car, a thin layer of white was already accumulating on the gardens and pathways, creating the perfect conditions for the fort that Cale had been dreaming about. Berwick stood in his own driveway for a moment, breathing the cold air and feeling the snow collect on his shoulders. 3 hours ago, he had been a man fleeing toward professional obligations that felt like chains around his soul. Now he was a father coming home to keep a promise that mattered more than any contract he had ever signed. He could hear voices from inside the house, Cale's excited chatter mixed with Zia's gentle responses, the sound of a family starting their day together. The scene should have been unremarkable, the kind of domestic routine that played out in millions of homes every morning. But to Berwick, who had spent 3 years as a stranger in his own house, it sounded like the most beautiful music ever composed. When he opened the front door, the warmth and light of home enveloped him like an embrace. The familiar sense of coffee and breakfast filled the air, along with something he hadn't noticed before, the indefinable aroma of love, of people who chose to be together, of a house that had finally become a home. Cale's voice drifted from the dining room. "Zia, do you think Daddy's plane has left yet? Do you think he remembered about our snow fort?" Berwick set down his luggage in the front hall and walked toward the sound of his son's voice, toward the family he had almost abandoned for the second time, toward the future he was finally ready to build. "I think," he said, as he appeared in the dining room doorway, still wearing his traveling clothes and dusted with snow, "that Daddy is exactly where he's supposed to be." Kyle looked up from his cereal with eyes that went wide with shock, then joy, then the kind of pure happiness that only children can express without reservation. "Daddy, you came back, you didn't go to Japan." "No, buddy," Berwick said, kneeling beside his son's chair and pulling him into the kind of hug he should have been giving every day for the past 3 years. "I realized there was something much more important I needed to do here. Something about a snow fort that's not going to build itself." Kyle threw his arms around his father's neck with the fierce intensity of a child who had learned not to expect miracles, but was brave enough to embrace one when it arrived. "Are we really going to build it today? Really, really?" "Really, really," Berwick confirmed, looking over his son's head at Zia, who was watching this reunion with tears streaming down her face. "Right after breakfast, and it's going to be the most magnificent snow fort in the history of snow forts." As he held his son in his arms, feeling the weight and warmth of the little boy who had waited so patiently for his father to come home, Berwick understood that he had just made the most important business decision of his life. He had chosen to invest in love instead of profit, in presence instead of power, in the one relationship that would matter long after all his corporate achievements had been forgotten. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, creating the perfect canvas for building dreams that would last far longer than any business empire. And inside the warm dining room of a house that was finally becoming a home, a father held his son and prepared to keep the most important promise he had ever made. 2 hours later, the Sloane estate had been transformed into a winter wonderland that looked like something from a fairy tale. The pristine gardens, usually maintained with museum-quality precision, were now dotted with snow angels, footprints, and the beginnings of what would become the most elaborate snow fort ever constructed on Long Island's Gold Coast. Beric had traded his $1,000 suit for jeans and a heavy sweater that he hadn't worn in years, clothes that felt foreign, on his body but somehow right for the work ahead. His expensive Italian leather shoes had been replaced by waterproof boots that Zaya had somehow produced from the estate's emergency supplies, and his manicured hands were now buried in thick gloves that would protect them from the honest work of building dreams with his son. Kyle had appointed himself chief architect of the project, consulting the detailed blueprints he had drawn on napkins during their breakfast conversations and directing operations with the authority of someone who had been planning this construction for weeks. His excitement was infectious, his joy so pure and unguarded that Beric found himself laughing more than he had in years. "The main tower has to go here," Kyle explained, pointing to a spot near the old oak tree that would provide natural support for their structure. "And we need a secret tunnel that connects to the watchtower over there, and we definitely need a window so we can see if any dragons are coming." "Dragons?" Beric asked, rolling a massive snowball that would serve as the foundation for their castle. "Should I be worried about dragons attacking our fort?" Kyle giggled with the delight of sharing an important secret. "Not bad dragons, Daddy. The good dragons might want to visit, and we need to be able to see them so we can invite them in for hot chocolate." Zia worked alongside them, her presence natural and essential rather than intrusive. She had an innate understanding of when to help and when to step back, when to offer suggestions and when to let father and son figure things out together. Her laughter rang out across the gardens as she watched Beric discover muscles he hadn't used in years and rediscover the simple pleasure of getting completely, utterly dirty in service of his child's happiness. "Tell me about school," Beric said as they worked together to lift a particularly large section of wall into place. "What's your favorite part of the day?" It was a simple question, but it opened floodgates of conversation that had been dammed up for too long. Cale talked about his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who read stories with different voices for all the characters. He shared his struggles with reading, how sometimes the letters seemed to dance around on the page, making words look backwards or upside down, and his fear that other kids would think he was stupid if they found out. "The words get all mixed up sometimes," Cale confided as they packed snow around the base of their fort. "Like they're playing hide-and-seek in my brain and I can't catch them." Beric stopped working and knelt beside his son, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in that small voice. Here was his child, struggling with something fundamental and frightening, and Beric had been so absent that he hadn't even known about it. "Kyle," he said gently, "there are lots of really smart, really amazing people who have trouble with letters sometimes. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your brain. It just means your brain works a little differently than other people's brains." "Really?" "Really. And you know what? We're going to find someone who specializes in helping kids with exactly this kind of thing. Someone who can teach you tricks for catching those sneaky letters when they try to hide." The relief on Kyle's face was immediate and profound. For months, he had been carrying this burden alone, convinced that his reading difficulties were evidence of some shameful inadequacy. Now his father was offering not just understanding but solutions, not just sympathy but action. "Will you help me practice?" Kyle asked, "even if it takes a long time?" "Especially if it takes a long time," Beric promised. "We'll practice every day for as long as it takes, until those letters know better than to mess with Cale Sloane." They worked in comfortable companionship for the next hour, building walls and towers, digging tunnels and creating windows, while Cale shared more of his inner world. He talked about his friend Marcus, who had taught him how to trade Pokemon cards, but had moved to California when his dad got a new job. He described his recurring dream about flying to space to visit his mother among the stars, bringing her updates about his life on Earth, and asking her advice about growing up without her. "Sometimes I talk to her picture before I go to sleep," Kyle admitted, as they added the finishing touches to their snow fort's main entrance. "I tell her about my day and ask her to help me be brave when things are scary." "What kinds of things are scary?" Beric asked, though he suspected he already knew some of the answers. "When you have to go away for work," Kyle said simply. "When I think maybe you won't come back like Mommy didn't come back. When I wonder if you love your work more than you love me." The honesty was devastating and necessary. Beric had to swallow hard before he could respond, fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm him. "Oh, buddy," he said, pulling Kyle into his arms despite their snow-covered gloves and the cold wind that was picking up around them. "I love you more than anything in the whole universe. More than work, more than money, more than anything I could ever build or buy or achieve. And I'm never going to leave you the way Mommy had to leave us, never. Promise?" "I promise. And when I make promises to you from now on, they're going to be promises I can keep." As they put the final touches on their snow fort, a masterpiece of childhood imagination brought to life through collaborative effort, Beric realized that they had built something far more significant than a winter playground. They had constructed a bridge across 3 years of distance, a foundation for the relationship they would build together in all the years to come. The business world's reaction to Beric's decision was swift and predictable. By Monday morning, his phone was buzzing with increasingly frantic calls from board members, investors, and partners who couldn't understand how a man they had considered utterly reliable could suddenly become so irresponsible. The Tokyo deal had indeed collapsed without his personal intervention, taking with it not only the projected profits, but also several satellite opportunities that had depended on the expansion's success. Financial news networks ran segments analyzing Beric's unexpected absence from crucial negotiations, with talking heads speculating about everything from health problems to hostile takeovers to psychological breakdown. Industry competitors who had once feared his strategic brilliance began testing the waters, probing for weaknesses in deals they would never have dared challenge during his previous reign of corporate invincibility. Margaret, his long-suffering assistant, fielded hundreds of calls with increasingly creative explanations for her boss's unavailability. She had worked for demanding executives before, but she had never encountered one who simply refused to engage with crises that would have sent his previous self into overdrive. "Mr. Sloan is taking some personal time to reassess his priorities," she told callers, a line that became legendary in Manhattan business circles for its diplomatic vagueness. But Beric was surprisingly calm about the chaos swirling around his professional empire. He spent Monday morning having breakfast with Cale and Zia, then drove his son to school personally, something he hadn't done since Cale was 3 years old. The experience of walking his child to the classroom, meeting his teacher face to face, and seeing the environment where Cale spent his days was revelatory. Mrs. Patterson, a veteran educator with 30 years of experience, was clearly surprised. To meet the famous Beric Sloan in person, rather than through the usual channels of nannies and assistants. "Mr. Sloan," she said, shaking his hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to dealing with distracted parents, "Cale is such a bright boy. I'm so glad we finally get to meet." The word "finally" carried gentle reproach, a reminder that this was the first time Beric had appeared at his son's school, despite Cale being in her class for 3 months. "I want to discuss Cale's reading progress," Beric said, choosing to focus on the future rather than dwelling on past absences. "He's mentioned some challenges with letter recognition, and I'd like to know how we can best support him." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened, clearly pleased to encounter a parent who was asking the right questions. "Cale is showing classic signs of dyslexia," she explained as they watched the boy hang up his backpack and greet his classmates. "It's actually quite common and completely manageable with the right support. I have some recommendations for specialists who work specifically with children his age." They spent 20 minutes discussing strategies, resources, and ways that Beric could reinforce learning at home. It was the kind of conversation that should have happened months earlier, the kind of parental engagement that Cale had been desperately needing. When Beric finally left the school, he had appointments scheduled with a learning specialist, a new understanding of his son's daily challenges, and a reading program designed specifically for children with dyslexia. More importantly, he had taken the first concrete steps toward becoming the kind of father who showed up for the small daily requirements of parenting rather than just the grand gestures. That afternoon, he did something unprecedented. He cleared his calendar and drove to Zia's apartment in Queens to pick her up for Kyle's school pickup. It was a modest two-bedroom unit in a working-class neighborhood, clean and comfortable, but a world away from the luxury of Manhattan penthouses and Long Island estates. "You didn't have to come all this way," Zia said as she got into his car, but her smile suggested she was pleased by the gesture. "I wanted to see where you live," Beric admitted. "I realized I know almost nothing about your life outside our house." As they drove toward Cale's school, Zia shared stories about her sister Amara, who was in her final semester of nursing school and working part-time at a community clinic in Atlanta. She talked about her mother, who had fought ovarian cancer with extraordinary grace and dignity, never complaining about the pain or the financial strain of treatment that insurance didn't fully cover. "She used to say that every day you get to love someone is a gift," Zia said, her voice soft with memory. "Even the hard days, even the days when love costs you something you thought you couldn't afford to lose." The observation hit Beric with particular force, coming as it did on a day when his choice to love his son was costing him millions in lost business opportunities. "Do you regret leaving teaching?" he asked. Zia was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the care it deserved. "I miss the classroom," she said finally. "I miss the moment when a struggling student suddenly understands a concept they've been wrestling with for weeks. I miss being part of those breakthrough moments when children discover they're smarter and more capable than they ever imagined." She looked out the window at the suburban landscape rolling past. "But I don't regret the choice I made. Amara needed me, and now Cale needs me. And sometimes love requires us to change direction even when we're not sure where the new path leads." When they arrived at the school, Cale ran to them with the excitement of a child who was still adjusting to the miracle of having his father appear for routine pickups. The drive home was filled with his chatter about the day's adventures, a science experiment involving volcanoes, a reading lesson where he successfully decoded 3 new words, and a playground incident where he had stood up for a smaller child who was being bullied. "Tommy Chen was being mean to Sarah Martinez," Kyle reported with the seriousness of someone delivering an important news bulletin. "He said her lunch smelled weird and that she probably ate dog food. So I told him that was rude and that Sarah's lunch smelled delicious and that maybe he was just jealous because his lunch was boring." Beric felt a surge of pride at his son's compassion and courage. Here was evidence that despite his absence, despite the emotional neglect of the past 3 years, Kyle was developing into someone with strong moral instincts and the bravery to act on them. "That was very brave of you," Beric said, catching his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Standing up for people who are being treated unfairly is one of the most important things a person can do." "Zia says that being kind is more important than being popular," Kyle said, unconsciously highlighting the kind of value-based education he had been receiving from his nanny rather than his father. "Zia is absolutely right," Beric agreed, feeling a familiar pang of gratitude mixed with guilt at how much of his son's moral development he had outsourced to others. The real test of Beric's transformation came the following week, when the consequences of his choices began to manifest in ways that threatened not just profits, but the foundations of his business empire. The collapsed Tokyo deal had created a domino effect that was now toppling carefully constructed relationships across 3 continents. His board of directors called an emergency meeting, not to discuss quarterly projections or expansion strategies, but to address what they diplomatically termed leadership concerns about their CEO's recent behavior. The subtext was clear. They were considering whether Beric Sloan had become a liability to the company he had built. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m., exactly the time when Beric had promised to attend Cale's school performance of the Autumn Harvest Festival, where his son would be performing as a singing pumpkin in front of an audience of parents and grandparents. 3 years earlier, this would have been no contest. The board meeting would have taken priority without question, and Kyle would have sung his pumpkin song to an audience that didn't include his father, just as he had done for every school performance since his mother's death. But this Thursday was different because Beric was different. He called Margaret from his car as he drove toward Cale's school, his phone connected through Bluetooth so he could keep his hands on the wheel and his focus on the choice he was making. "Cancel the board meeting," he told his assistant, whose gasp was audible even through the car's speaker system. "Sir, I can't cancel a board meeting that was called specifically to address concerns about your leadership. The directors are flying in from 6 different cities. This could trigger a vote of no confidence." "Then let them vote," Beric said, his voice calmer than Margaret had ever heard it during a crisis. "I'm not missing my son's performance to discuss my leadership with people who measure everything in dollars and nothing in love. Mr. Sloan, they could remove you as CEO. Margaret, if they remove me for choosing my family over their fear, then I was working for the wrong people anyway." The conversation ended, but Beric could imagine the chaos that would ensue as Margaret tried to explain to a room full of billionaires that their CEO was prioritizing a children's harvest festival over their demands for accountability. At the school, Beric found himself in an elementary school auditorium filled with folding chairs and proud parents, surrounded by hand-drawn decorations and the kind of organized chaos that only elementary educators could orchestrate. He was overdressed in his business suit, but he was present, and that was what mattered. When Kyle appeared on stage wearing an orange costume that transformed him into the most adorable pumpkin in the history of agricultural theater, Beric felt his chest swell with a pride that no business achievement had ever generated. His son sang with gusto and danced with abandon, completely unself-conscious in his joy, his face glowing with the knowledge that his father was in the audience, watching every moment. During the final bow, Kyle spotted Beric in the crowd and waved, with such enthusiasm that several other parents turned to see who had inspired such excitement. The moment was captured by a dozen parent photographers, but Beric knew he would remember it perfectly, without any digital assistance, the image of his son's face lighting up with pure happiness at seeing his father in the audience. After the performance, as parents and children mingled in the hallway eating cookies and drinking apple cider, Mrs. Patterson approached Beric with a smile that suggested she understood the significance of his presence. "This is the first school event you've attended since Kyle started in my class," she said gently. "He's been so excited about your being here that he's talked about it for 3 days straight." The comment should have made Beric feel guilty, but instead, it filled him with determination. This was the first of many school events he would attend, the first of countless ways he would show up for his son's life. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table in the smaller dining room that had become their family sanctuary, Kyle regaled them with detailed accounts of his performance, analyzing every song and dance move with the dedication of a Broadway critic reviewing opening night. "Did you see when Marcus forgot his line and I whispered it to him?" Kyle asked, his eyes sparkling with the pleasure of having helped a friend succeed. "And did you see how loud everyone clapped when we did the finale?" "I saw everything," Beric assured him. "Every single moment. You were magnificent." The word choice was deliberate and accurate. Watching his son perform with such joy and confidence, knowing that his presence in the audience had contributed to that happiness, Beric had experienced something magnificent himself, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what mattered most. Zia watched these interactions with the quiet pleasure of someone who had helped facilitate healing. Over the past weeks, she had observed the gradual transformation of both father and son, had seen trust slowly rebuilt through daily choices and consistent presence. "Zia," Kyle said suddenly, his voice taking on the serious tone he used for important announcements. "I have a question for you." "What kind of question?" she asked, setting down her fork and giving him her full attention. "A big question. A really, really big question." Beric felt his pulse quicken, sensing that his son was about to venture into territory that would require careful navigation. "Okay," Zia said with the patience that had made her such an effective teacher. "I'm ready for your really, really big question." Kyle took a deep breath, as if preparing for a performance even more important than his pumpkin song. "Would you like to be my mom?" The question hung in the air like a bridge spanning a chasm, connecting the family they had become with the family they might choose to be officially. Zia's eyes filled with tears, and Beric felt his heart stop and restart in the space of a single breath. "Oh, sweetheart," Zia said, her voice thick with emotion. "That is a very big question indeed." "I know you're not my real mum," Kale continued with the earnest explanation of a child who had given this considerable thought. "But you love me like a real mum, and you love Daddy, and he loves you. And I thought maybe we could make it official." Like a real family, Beric watched this exchange with wonder and terror, amazed by his son's ability to see clearly what the adults had been dancing around for months. Kyle had identified the unspoken truth that none of them had dared to voice. They had already become a family in everything but name. "What do you think, Daddy?" Kyle asked, turning to his father with the confidence of someone who believed in happy endings. "Don't you think Zia would make a good mum for us?" The question required an answer that would shape their future. That would either move them towards something beautiful or maintain the careful distance they had been preserving. Beric looked at Zia, seeing in her eyes the same love and hope and terror that he felt in his own heart. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone defusing a bomb or proposing marriage, "that Zia would make the most wonderful mom in the world, if she wants to be." "Do you want to be our mom?" Kyle asked Zia directly, his 6-year-old heart open and vulnerable and brave in ways that put most adults to shame. Zia looked from son to father, seeing in both their faces the invitation to step fully into the love that had been growing between them for months. "More than anything," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks, "I would love nothing more than to be your mom, Kale, and your partner, Beric, if you'll have me." Kale launched himself from his chair into Zia's arms with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been granted his most important wish. Beric rose more slowly, his legs unsteady with the magnitude of what was happening, and joined the embrace that would seal their transformation from broken individuals into a complete family, standing there in their dining room, holding the woman who had saved them both, and the son who had taught him the true meaning of success. Beric understood that some investments paid dividends that could never be calculated in quarterly reports. Love, it turned out, was the only asset that grew stronger when shared, the only wealth that multiplied when divided, the only success that mattered when everything else had been stripped away. The empire he had built might survive his recent choices, or it might crumble under the weight of his absence, but the family he was building would last forever, rooted in presence rather than profit, in love rather than leverage, in the daily choice to show up for the people who mattered most. Outside the windows, snow was falling again, adding new layers to the fort they had built together, creating fresh possibilities for tomorrow's adventures. And inside their warm dining room, 3 people who had found each other against all odds held tight to the love that had transformed them all. The proposal came on a Saturday morning in May, 6 months after the airport decision that had changed everything. But it didn't unfold in any way that Beric had imagined during the sleepless nights when he'd been planning how to ask Zia to marry him. Spring had transformed the estate gardens into a riot of color and life. Tulips and daffodils had given way to roses and peonies, cherry blossoms had bloomed and fallen like snow, and the old oak tree, where they had built their winter, fort was now dressed in emerald leaves that rustled with the songs of nesting birds. The grounds had become a living testament to renewal, to the possibility of beauty growing from seasons of dormancy. Beric had been carrying an engagement ring in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive. He had envisioned romantic dinners, sunset walks through the garden, perhaps a recreation of the spot where they had first talked about becoming a family. But perfect moments, he was learning, were less important than authentic ones. The morning started like any other Saturday. Breakfast together in the smaller dining room, Kale chattering about his plans for the day, while Zia listened with the kind of focused attention that had first caught Beric's notice. The learning specialist they had found for Kyle's dyslexia had been working wonders, and their son's confidence with reading had blossomed along with his general happiness. "Can we work on the garden today?" Kyle asked, syrup from his pancakes, making his smile sticky and bright. "I want to plant the sunflowers we bought yesterday, and I want to make a special place for Mom's memory flowers." The request had become part of their weekend routine, tending the memorial garden they had created together, a living tribute to Sarah that celebrated her life rather than mourning her death. Zia had suggested the project, understanding that healing required acknowledgement rather than avoidance, that Kyle needed ways to include his mother in their new family structure. "Of course we can work in the garden," Beric said, but before he could continue, Kyle interrupted with the kind of announcement that only children can make with complete seriousness. "But first, I have something really important to do, something I've been planning for weeks." He slipped down from his chair with the purposeful movement of someone on a mission, disappearing from the dining room while Beric and Zia exchanged curious glances. "Any idea what he's up to?" Beric asked. "With Kyle, it could be anything from building a rocket ship to writing a letter to the president," Zia replied, her eyes sparkling with affectionate amusement. They could hear sounds of activity from the garden, Kyle's voice giving instructions to himself, the rustle of leaves, and what sounded like items being moved around with considerable effort. After 15 minutes of mysterious preparation, he appeared in the dining room doorway, grass stains on his knees and dirt under his fingernails, his face glowing with excitement and nervous anticipation. "Zia," he said with the formality of someone about to make a very important speech, "I need you to come outside with me. There's something I want to show you." "Should I come too?" Beric asked, though he was already rising from his chair. "Yes, Daddy. You definitely need to come. But Zia has to go first, because this is mostly for her." They followed Kyle through the house and out into the garden, where spring morning light was painting everything in shades of gold and green. He led them along the familiar paths toward the area where they had built their winter fort, now transformed into a natural amphitheater by the spreading branches of the oak tree. There, in the center of the space where they had shared so many moments of joy and discovery, Kyle had created something extraordinary. Using flowers from the cutting garden, colorful stones from the landscape supply, and careful planning that showed remarkable patience for a 6-year-old, he had spelled out a message that took Zia's breath away. "Will you be my mommy forever?" But the proposal didn't end with words. Kyle had arranged a small display area with items that told the story of their family's journey. The original drawing he had made of the three of them during those first weeks of breakfast together, photographs from their various adventures, and a small wooden box that had belonged to his mother. "I know you're already like my mom," Kyle said, his voice shaking slightly with the importance of the moment. "But I want to make it official. I want everyone to know that you belong to us, and we belong to you." Zia knelt beside the display, tears streaming down her face as she took in the care and thought that had gone into this 6-year-old's proposal. Each item had been chosen deliberately. Each element of the arrangement spoke to the depth of Kyle's understanding about family and love and commitment. "And I asked Daddy if it was okay," Kyle continued, "and he said yes, and he said he wants to ask you something too, but I wanted to ask first because it was my idea." Beric felt his heart expand to what seemed like impossible dimensions, overwhelmed by his son's generous spirit and the perfect rightness of this moment. All his carefully planned romantic scenarios paled in comparison to the authentic beauty of a child's direct approach to love. "Oh, Kyle," Zia whispered, pulling him into her arms, "this is the most beautiful proposal anyone has ever received. Yes, sweetheart. Yes, I will be your mommy forever. I would be honored to be your mommy forever." The joy that spread across Kyle's face was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, pure and radiant and completely transformative. "Really? Really, really? Really, really?" Zia confirmed, holding him tight, while Beric watched his son's dream come true in real time. "Good," Kyle said with satisfaction, then turned to his father with expectant eyes. "Now it's your turn, Daddy." Beric had imagined this moment differently, but he couldn't imagine it better. He pulled the small velvet box from his pocket. Not the massive diamond he might have chosen in his previous life, but a simple, elegant ring that spoke of commitment rather than conquest. "Zia," he said, kneeling beside her in the grass while their son watched with barely contained excitement. "Kyle isn't the only one who wants to make this official. I've been carrying this ring around for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But I realize now that the perfect moment is any moment when we're together." He opened the box to reveal a ring that caught the morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. "I love you," he continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. "I love your kindness, your wisdom, your ability to see the best in people even when they can't see it in themselves. I love the way you've healed our family, the way you've taught me how to be present, how to choose love over fear every single day." Zia was crying openly now, but her smile was radiant. "I love the mother you've become to Kale, and I love the partner you've become to me. Will you marry us? Will you make this family official in every way that matters?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it. Yes to forever." As Beric slipped the ring onto her finger, Kyle cheered with the enthusiasm of someone whose most important wish had just been granted. "We're going to be a real family," he announced to the garden, to the birds, to the universe itself. "A really, really real family." The wedding took place in their garden 3 months later, in August, when the roses were at their peak and the late summer light turned everything golden. It was a small ceremony, just the people who had witnessed their journey from broken to whole, from separate to united, from a house full of expensive emptiness to a home full of priceless love. Kyle served as both ring-bearer and best man, taking his responsibilities seriously while still managing to be completely, joyfully himself. He had written his own vows to Zia, which he delivered with the solemnity of someone making a sacred promise. "I promise to always tell you when I'm sad or scared or happy. I promise to help you take care of Daddy when he gets too worried about work stuff. I promise to share my toys and my books and my hugs. And I promise to help you learn about being a mom to me because you're already really good at it, but practice makes perfect." He paused, consulting a crumpled piece of paper where he had written his most important thoughts. "I promise to love you forever and ever, even when I'm a grown-up and even when I have kids of my own, because you chose to be my mommy when you didn't have to, and that makes you the best mommy in the whole world." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as he finished his speech and carefully handed over the rings that would make their family official in the eyes of the law and the world. Beric's vows were longer but no less heartfelt. He spoke about second chances and the courage to change, about the difference between success and fulfillment, about learning to measure wealth in moments rather than dollars. "Zia, you didn't just save my son," he said, his voice carrying across the garden to the small gathering of friends and family who had come to witness this transformation. "You saved me. You showed me that the most important meetings happen around breakfast tables, that the most valuable negotiations involve bedtime stories, that the greatest success is being present for the people you love." He looked at Kyle, who was beaming with pride at his role in bringing his parents together. "You taught me that being a father isn't about providing for the future. It's about showing up for the present. You helped me understand that love isn't something you earn through achievement. It's something you nurture through attention, through presence, through the daily choice to put family before everything else." Zia's vows were simple and profound, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. "Beric, I promise to love you exactly as you are while encouraging you to become everything you're meant to be. I promise to support your dreams while reminding you that the most important dreams are the ones we build together." She turned to include Kyle in her promise. "Kyle, I promise to be the mother you deserve, not perfect, but present. Not always right, but always loving. I promise to celebrate your victories, comfort your defeats, and remind you every day that you are worthy of love simply because you exist." She looked back at Beric, her eyes shining with tears and joy. "I promise to choose this family every day in small moments and big ones, in easy times and difficult ones. I promise to build a life with you that honors the past while embracing the future, that creates space for grief and joy to coexist, that proves love multiplies when it's shared." As they exchanged rings, a gentle breeze stirred the garden, carrying the scent of roses and the sound of distant laughter from children. Playing in neighboring yards, it felt like a benediction, like the universe itself was celebrating this union of three hearts that had found their way to each other through loss and healing, through choice and commitment. The reception was held in the same garden where they had built their first snow fort, where Cale had spelled out his proposal in flowers and stones, where they had shared countless meals and conversations and moments of simple joy. String lights twinkled overhead like captured stars, and soft music played, while their small gathering of loved ones celebrated not just a wedding, but the birth of a family that had been chosen rather than simply inherited. As the evening progressed, and the guests gradually departed, Beric found himself standing on the terrace, watching Zia and Cale dance to a song that drifted from speakers hidden among the roses. They were both laughing at something Cale had said, their faces illuminated by golden light and love. A year ago, Beric would have been checking his phone, thinking about quarterly reports, planning his next move in the endless chess game of business. Tonight he was completely present, completely at peace, completely aware that this moment, this exact moment, was what success actually looked like. The business empire had survived his transformation, though it looked different now. He had restructured his role, delegating operational control to trusted executives while maintaining strategic oversight that didn't require constant travel or midnight meetings. The company was actually performing better than before, freed from the micromanagement of a CEO who had once believed he was indispensable. Some competitors had initially seen his work-life balance as weakness, but they had quickly learned that a man who had his priorities straight was more focused, more decisive, and more creative than one who was constantly scattered by competing demands. The business press had eventually reframed his story as an example of executive evolution rather than corporate breakdown, but none of that mattered as much as the scene unfolding before him. Kyle ran over from the dance area, slightly out of breath from twirling with his new mother. "Daddy, will you dance with us?" he asked, his face glowing with happiness. "Always," Beric said, and he meant it in every possible sense of the word. As the three of them danced together in their garden, surrounded by the flowers they had planted and the life they had built, the narrator's voice returned one final time. Sometimes, the greatest success comes not from gaining everything you thought you wanted, but from losing everything you thought you needed. Sometimes the most important meeting of your life happens at a breakfast table with a 6-year-old who just wants to tell you about his dreams. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in the simple act of coming home. Beric Sloan had learned that love isn't something you earn through achievement. It's something you nurture through presence. He discovered that being a father isn't about providing for the future. It's about showing up for the present. And in choosing to build a family rather than just an empire, he found a wealth that no market crash could diminish and a success that no competitor could steal. The little boy who once sat alone at a table too big for him now sits at the center of a family built on choice and commitment, on daily decisions to show up and stay present and love without condition. The mansion that had been a monument to loneliness became a home filled with laughter and music, and the sound of people who had chosen to belong to each other. And in that transformation, from isolation to connection, from having everything to having what matters, from success without meaning to significance without limit, lies a truth that every parent needs to hear. It's never too late to come home. It's never too late to choose love over ambition. It's never too late to become the person your child needs you to be. The snow fort they built that first weekend together has long since melted, replaced by flower gardens and vegetable patches and a treehouse where Cale writes stories about dragons and adventures. But the foundation they built that day, trust rebuilt through presence, love demonstrated through choice, continues to grow stronger with each passing season. Beric still works, still builds, still dreams of the future. But now his work serves his family rather than consuming it. His achievements enhance their life together rather than replacing it. His success is measured not in quarterly earnings, but in bedtime stories read, school plays attended, and promises kept to a little boy who needed his father more than the world needed another billionaire. Every morning, they gather around the breakfast table that has become the center of their universe. Three people who found each other through loss and healing, who chose each other through patience and forgiveness, who love each other through presence and commitment. They talk about dreams and fears, about homework and dragons, about the 1,000 small details that make up a life lived together. Kyle is 8 now, reading chapter books with growing confidence, his dyslexia transformed from a source of shame into a superpower that makes him think differently about problems and solutions. He talks about becoming an astronaut or a dragon researcher, or maybe a teacher like his mom Zaya. But whatever he chooses, he knows his parents will be there to support his dreams and catch him if he falls. Zaya has returned to teaching, but now at a private school, where she can continue her mission of helping children discover their own brilliance while still being present for her family. She has found the perfect balance between her calling to serve children and her commitment to the child who calls her mom. And Berik? Berik has learned the most important lesson of all, that the greatest legacy you can leave your child isn't a business empire or a trust fund or any material inheritance. The greatest legacy is the memory of a parent who showed up, who listened, who chose love over everything else, who proved through daily actions that nothing in the world was more important than being their father. On quiet evenings, when the Gi house is peaceful and his family is safe and happy around him, Berik sometimes thinks about that night when he almost got on a plane to Tokyo. He thinks about the choice that changed everything, the moment when he finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him all along. That presence is the only present that truly matters, that showing up is the only success that lasts, that being loved is worth more than being admired by strangers who will never know your heart. The man who once owned everything but possessed nothing has become the father who has everything that matters. The CEO who commanded billions learned to value the currency of hugs and bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. The empire builder discovered that the most important construction project of his life was building a relationship with his son, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of presence at a time. If this story touched your heart and reminded you what truly matters in life, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue sharing powerful stories of love, redemption, and second chances. Thank you for being part of our community, and remember, it's never too late to choose love over everything else.